Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Tax, the show for growth-minded CPAs and real estate pros in tax. I'm TJ Sponsel. In today's episode, we will compare state and federal R&D tax credit opportunities and share our approach on state examinations and best practices. Joining us today on Let's Talk Tax is David Seibel. David is a principal in McGuire Sponsel's R&D tax credit practice, specializing in IRS regulations and audit defense. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me, TJ.
Well, David, obviously in our old format, our McGuire on the Wire, you and I did a few of these over the years. So this is our first on the new platform of the podcast. So for those of you who never joined us before, welcome to this edition of Let's Talk Tax. David and I have spent a lot of time over the years talking about federal. That's it kind of seems to drive, with our R&D practice, the size it is, the number of people that are in that practice, the number of the hundreds of companies that we serve. Federal tax credits drive the conversation.
Correct.
But I think one area that is not often discussed is state tax credits. We reside in Indiana, one of our offices. We have the 5 offices we have. One's in Indiana that has a very lucrative credit. Okay, and then we have other states that have zero credit. We have some states that have a credit that looks good on paper but is pretty lousy in practice. Then you have states that are bringing up new credits. And so I thought today's edition, we kind of dive into the states a little bit more. Obviously, an understanding that each state has its own conformity to federal and how that applies. All of them are different how they examine these claims, which we have felt in recent years. So I thought we would kind of look at that a little deeper and then maybe touch on some other issues that our clients are facing related to the R&D tax credits. So with that, let's kind of break it off into 3 different parts.
Okay.
States that have good credits, okay? They're good on paper. They're good in reality. They're easy to utilize, so to speak. There's no tricks or gimmicks. States that have what we call a moderate credit, okay, that maybe is not as lucrative, but there is one. It's consistent. It's just the dollars aren't there very high. And then states that have what we call unique credits, maybe application-based or another type of structure regarding the R&D tax credit, okay?
Okay.
So with that, kind of what do you see, let's take the lucrative credits from Indiana. What are some of the, obviously being here in the Midwest, other states have great credits. What are you seeing in terms of Indiana, those lucrative credits? How are we approaching that for clients? Is there any trap doors, i.e. Increased examination of research credits? Kind of walk us through some of the states that have the lucrative credits and the pros and cons.
Yeah, so a lot of those states that do have those lucrative credits mirror pretty closely the federal credit criteria, as well as the calculation methods too. I think really the only main difference between those are the credit percentages that are utilized. So you have, for example, like you mentioned, Indiana. There's Wisconsin. There's a few others that very closely mimic that federal credit guidelines, with pretty much just the only main stipulation that the research is conducted within that state, as opposed to the federal credit where it can be conducted anywhere within the U.S. But certainly those states that do have that are more lucrative, that the states do tend to examine those more, just because there are a lot more dollars at stake. So, it really comes down to similar to how we conduct our federal research credit studies, in that it's all about education and truly educating the client on, all right, this is the federal criteria. This is how states like Indiana approach things. Here are some potential pitfalls. Here are some potential risk areas that they go through that they might more commonly target. Like for Indiana, very much it goes back to basically just the 4-part test and firmly establishing that research is taking place. Certain other states focus more on supplies that might be utilized and making sure those are more focused in on the actual research being conducted. So it's kind of a wide bucket, and each state scrutinizes a certain area a little bit more depending on where those areas of increased risk are per state.
Because in a state like Indiana or Wisconsin, we're not talking about a 1% credit. We're talking about if you have, for every $100,000 of spend that generates that 6 to 8% federal credit, Indiana could add another $5,000 on top of that, correct?
Correct. Yeah. That can be an extra 5 to 10%. Sometimes the Indiana credit exceeds the federal credit. So we've seen. So it definitely can be very high dollars, and with very high dollars comes obviously the states are going to want to make sure that those that are claiming it are entitled to those credits.
Okay. All right. And for states like Indiana, I think one of the things that we've changed, and we touched on the examination. Obviously, in 10 years ago, it was more of a rubber stamp. The Indiana really didn't, and a lot of states did not look at these examinations, and we've seen this proliferation over the years where I'm just certain audits are popping out. Iowa, Indiana, Texas, Ohio. What has changed there? Is it such a big line item and for a lot of these states that now they're suddenly realizing how expensive the credit is, and that a lot of people don't do the due diligence required before claiming the credit?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I mean, you mentioned before just how large these credits can be. I think as states start to look in and examine some of these claims, some of the higher ups realize that some of these dollars amounts were pretty massive, and then possibly looking into some of the data of companies that are claiming the credit, industries that may not be the most qualified from the get-go. That I think there's a very strong possibility that they've looked into those, and as a result, those rubber stamps they've realized have cost a lot of money, and that it's opened the door for people to claim them when they're not entitled to. So then that naturally had led to more scrutiny by necessity being applied.
How about these with moderate credits? Ohio, Illinois come to mind just because they're neighboring states, and we do a lot of work in those states. Iowa used to have a lucrative credit, and now it's gone down to a moderate. Is there, when we say that, are kind of the overall effective credit range? What are those typically for those kind of states?
Yeah, for Iowa and Illinois, it is a lot lower, and again, that's because it's a slight modification of how it's actually calculated as opposed to the federal credit. It really is truly has to be increased in the base year amounts to yield a credit. So it's maybe in the 1% to 3% range. But similarly, I mean, even a couple of years ago, Ohio, for example, was very much a rubber stamp. The site visits were very much just check the box type of situations, and then they'd be fully allowed. But then, like I said, Ohio, even over the last couple of years, has really started to examine some of these claims more because of even though there aren't large dollar amounts as it relates to when compared to some of the other states, it's still a significant amount of money for the states to be able to grant. So that only leads to more examinations being done by those states.
Well, and I think one thing that we've experienced in these examinations is that we understand there's always going to be the chance of audit at the federal state level, but it feels like our experience within McGuire Sponsel is that the IRS is a little bit more outside of the temperament of the agent, the knowledge of the agent. The process is somewhat known, and there is U.S. tax court law that we can lean on, and there's many, I should say, navigational beacons, if you will, that we can lean on to give us a solid position. With these states, that's not the case at all times. Is that correct?
Yeah, it can kind of be the Wild West of things. You can encounter states that don't conform to the federal conformity, so you can cite the tax courts as somewhat precedent, but that they're not. The states aren't bound to those. They might have slightly differing criteria from the federal credit, where those tax court cases don't hold as much weight. Sometimes the agents are just very fresh, very new. They're not, it could be their first or second research credit examination, and they're not really sure how to deal with things. They might not know the full scope of what the research credit entails, might be creating their own interpretations on how things are done. So it really can be kind of a mixed bag in terms of those state exams. And also, they don't have any state tax law probably either to take a position on. There's just not the frequency of audits and cases going all the way up to some type of state tax judicial level. It's not there. And so you can sit there and lean on the federal all you want, but that's not unique to Indiana or Ohio or Illinois. I know that's something that also is out there. Right. Yeah. And then, a lot of the actual state code that's on the records, very heavily references the federal, and some parts they reference, some parts they don't. So it really is, you just have to try to navigate those waters as best you can with those examining agents.
And then that third bucket is those unique states. And obviously, nature of our practice, we have a lot of clients in Pennsylvania. the Pennsylvania credit. Can you kind of walk everybody through that?
Yeah, Pennsylvania is a unique one, and there's a lot of other states in that area that have similar type of processes. That Pennsylvania is an application-based credit. So what the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue does is that they allocate a certain amount of funds that's specifically for companies to claim for the research credit. I believe for the 2024 tax year, I believe it's about $60 million, and a portion of that is set aside for small businesses as well. So the process for that is companies claim the credits that they're due based off of the calculation method that's available. They'll submit it through a portal, and then at the end, by a application deadline of December 1st, the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue then takes all of that data, and then they'll see, do they hit the cap of the amount that they were set aside to award. If they have, then they prorate the credits appropriately, and then they will send out those amounts that the companies can then claim, which then they can then either amend their returns to claim it on that return or use it going forward. Pennsylvania is also a unique one where they can also sell the credit too, which is a nice benefit specifically for those taxpayers that don't have the tax liability to be able to utilize them.
What is that? Maybe you may not know the exact percentage, but off the top of your head, but what has been the allocation? It seems like, is it client goes and applies for $50,000, they get 50%, 60 cents on the dollar? What do you know what that approximately is?
Yeah, so the most recent data indicates that I believe large businesses got about 30% of what they claimed, and then small businesses, actually it's increased a little bit. It's now about 60% of what they claim. Okay. So that's just based off the most recent data. We'll see as this latest filing period ends how that shakes out. But that's been the most current trend. So again, it's really been beneficial for those smaller companies, as they're the ones that don't have the tax liability typically to use them, and if they don't, then they can sell that and still benefit from the credit.
Another unique situation with some states, aren't some states really, they're more targeted in terms of only certain types of expenses, like Kentucky? I think Texas, if I remember correctly, is really kind of trying to exclude certain industries or certain types of businesses from the credit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Kentucky is a very unique one, and it's pretty much based just on if you have a dedicated research facility and the costs associated with that. So that's one that's just completely removed from the federal credit criteria. It has its own definition and everything. And then there are certain states like Texas, again, going back to, they still do have a very lucrative credit, but then they've realized as they've started to examine some of these claims that they need to rein in the types of industries that have traditionally claimed the credit. And so again, they've come out in recent years on saying these certain industries can't claim the credit. Iowa is another one, going back to, they're starting to wind down the amount of expenses that can be included for supplies and changing the definition of who can be included toward wages, as well as just adjusting down the certain industries that aren't eligible to claim the credit as well, because Iowa used to have a very, very lucrative credit. But again, going back to, there's some people that really took advantage of the situation, sure. Particularly the refundability aspect of Iowa, where they realized they really need to start reining in, who could qualify.
I remember years ago, Wisconsin had the super credit. They had the regular credit. I mean, it seems like states every once in a while come out with this very unique program. It's temporary, mm-hmm. but I remember back in the years ago, we would do these Wisconsin, and they would the super credit just had some ridiculous multiplier on it, where it was generating far more credit than a taxpayer could even use. Yeah,
you would have situations where someone would claim a regular $17,000 one and then have a $100,000 super credit, and it's to your point, the utilization just wasn't there. It was nice on paper. But then, going to utilize it proved to be a little bit difficult.
Well, part of your responsibilities at our R&D practice, not only do you lead the day-to-day operations of it, but you're obviously the one that's involved in a lot of IRS examinations, mm-hmm. and either IRS examinations or state examinations. Is that, and I think one of the things is, obviously, years ago they standardized the IDRs, and we know what that process looks like. But mm-hmm. also, I think it's important to know, because there's a couple points I want to kind of I want us to walk the listeners through today, is that the agents really have a lot of, they place a lot of set the tone, if you will, for an examination. Okay, and their role, their aptitude, their experience, their maybe agendas they have, for lack of a better word, can really have a direct impact on the process of an examination. Can you kind of walk us through the experiences we've had here at McGuire Sponsel with those with the agents?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, TJ, it really is kind of luck of the draw almost with who you get as an agent and kind of their philosophy to conducting exams and how they're ultimately going to approach the exam. So sometimes we've had agents that don't have any experience with the research credit, and we have to kind of educate them on what are the qualifying criteria. We've had some that have drawn their line in the sand of they will not be swayed in any sort of direction, no matter how much you try to show them the tax code and the applicable tax law. We've had certain agents that have come up with their own interpretations where we had one that he said, well, the credit is called the credit for increasing research activities, and this client actually had a decrease from the previous year, they're not eligible for the credit. And it's like, well, that's not what this is at all. If you could look at any length of time looking at any of the tax forms and tax codes show you that is absolutely not a qualifying criteria at all. So it is a lot of education, a lot of
patience,
a lot of patience. But at the end of the day, I think you have to approach it with realizing these people are just ultimately trying to do their job. So
Absolutely.
So trying to approach it with a level of respect, and just kind of making sure that you're cordial toward them, but then also making sure that you're firm in some of the positions that you take, and that sometimes the IRS agents will want you to just completely open the books, and that's very costly to the taxpayer in trying to compile all the information that the agents are requesting. So sometimes you have to just kind of narrow the focus on what ultimately is going to be the scope of the examination and just limiting it to the particular issues at hand. Even though the taxpayer ultimately has nothing to hide, there's still a time value factor in that, and not needing to waste the taxpayer's time because of information that's not relevant at all.
Well, that's well said, David, because I think the situation, and I've run into this personally, is that I think there are bad actors out there in terms of firms that say they do the R&D credits, and they're giving a lot of bad education to taxpayers, to industries. And I think of, there's these that operate, there's a firm that was targeting dental practices, basically saying every time you put a crown in somebody's mouth, that's qualified research. We've seen it in construction, where firms set a very low bar for qualified research, and then tell a general contractor that if they just got to figure out how to take scaffolding from a 3-story building to build a 4-story building, they qualify. So those, and the IRS calls those promoters. And we're seeing on the ERTC front now too. So I completely agree with you. They have a job to do, and they're probably coming in, if they've never heard of McGuire Sponsel and don't understand the sincerity and the diligence that we put in to building a claim and vetting that on the client's behalf. We got to build some credibility up with them, because they may be predisposed because of a prior experience or the experience of a colleague or whatever the case may be. So I completely agree that patience is required. We're trying to both do our jobs and come up with the best answer we can, given we are in a very gray area of tax law. That's also the reality,
if not the grayest. Yeah,
exactly. And we've seen that, and obviously we're sitting here, in 2024, 174 has not been fixed yet. We're seeing that even more on 174 front, and just having very, very hard conversations with our clients. Not that we're trying to rewrite tax law here, but we have empathy for them, and it's just a gray area of law that we're just trying to figure out the best path for them, and to give them the right answer and give them good counsel.
Yeah, keeping them compliant and trying to minimize their tax liability as much as we can.
Exactly. So I think one other area regarding the agent and regarding IRS examinations I want to touch on is that something that does come up from time to time is that we have been fortunate to transition companies that have used other providers to McGuire Sponsel. And I think one of the challenges that we have and during those times is that we kind of resetting to what is qualified research for them. And the hardest situation can be is when they've gone through an examination. Is that we come in the 2023 tax year and they've been taking this methodology that we don't agree with, and they go, well, I had an examination in 19 and there was no change, therefore it must be right. Kind of how do we advise our clients in those situations? The situation going, no, yeah, you probably got lucky that you got an agent that didn't dig real deep or have a great understanding, or maybe just want to get it off their desk. How do we help them reset the definition of qualified research and navigate sometimes maybe that false sense of confidence they have in the methodology they have been using?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, they have to realize that, just because something was not particularly examined well in the past doesn't give them, immunity from taking that same position going forward. And exams even 4 to 5 years ago are much different than they are today. So it really comes back down to education, letting them know what are the actual criteria of the credit, what does qualify, what does not qualify most of the time, and then just walking through, okay, here are some of the positions that you have taken in the past that may not be in your best interest to do so going forward. And then part of that conversation as well has to be, what's the actual usability here of the tax liability, of the tax credits? Because you could have a situation where, maybe because of those previous providers, they have a lot of carry forwards built up, so they can then use those and going forward while we're resetting the base years to what qualifies and what doesn't. And then also, just educating them on, all right, how much tax credits can you actually use? Is it really worth taking this aggressive position to put an entire claim in jeopardy when you can't even utilize all of it? Or does it make sense to follow the letter of the law? Obviously it is a gray area, so there are, certain positions that, that they may choose to take, or we may advise them to take. But what ultimately is going to be the benefit here? I think that has to be part of the equation as well, is that tax liability equation and analysis.
Sure. David, kind of a question I like to ask a lot during a lot of podcasts in terms of our experts in our different practice areas is, what are the myths associated with the R&D credit? I mean, we've been doing this a long time, you and I, okay? And we've have the good fortune of serving a lot of clients of a lot of different shapes and sizes. Sitting here in 2024, what are still a couple of the big myths that you see around the R&D credit?
That there's a few. One, that even if a project does qualify, that all of the expenses that are includable that are associated with the project are includable. Doesn't matter if they're related to the development process at all. We've seen some that have included drivers and some people that are very clearly not a part of the development process be included in some of these claims. Also, those that some have claimed that just if you're building anything, then you qualify. Whereas to your point, you mentioned before, those construction companies that don't bear the engineering responsibility, or they're just carrying out the instructions and trying to figure out how to use scaffolding to go from 3 stories to 4 stories. That's another big one. It's just clearly not qualified once you actually dig through the criteria in previous case law.
I would say one of the myths I continue to run into is that the risk of losing money. The risk of losing money, if you lose money in a job, is not the threshold. It's that it has nothing to do with it. Now that's called business risk.
Correct.
And doesn't connect you to the R&D credit. I mean, that's the one that I continue to kind of see over and over again, is that, or if I'm doing something new for the first time, okay, or training. If you're buying off the shelf, you're buying off the shelf something, you're plugging it in and seeing it work. I'm spending time getting trained. That's not qualified. I mean, I think that's kind of the opportunity that we have as a firm, is that I say often is that one of the highest priorities at McGuire Sponsel is our commitment to the CPA client relationship.
Absolutely.
And so we have a long-term view of our firm. So we're not chasing one engagement. We're developing and nurturing relationships with CPAs. So we're okay with giving good counsel, even though it's not the counsel that they want to hear, because we want the CPAs to be dependent on our counsel and look to us and seek us out when it comes to answering challenging questions.
Yeah, I mean, we've had situations where we said, sorry, you don't qualify, and it was unfortunate for that potential client, but at the end of the day, to your point, that we place a high value on our knowledge and our CPA relationships, and want to make sure that if the CPA is the one signing those tax returns, that they are put in the best position possible and not subject to potentially penalties themselves or losing their license or anything like that.
Well, we always like to end with a rapid fire question.
Okay.
And your rapid fire question today, David, Sly is your nickname. David, is that what is the most eccentric client that you've had in all the years you've been here at McGuire Sponsel?
Yeah, I think probably one of the most unique ones we've ever had was a ziplining company. So that may not seem like the most qualified on the front, on the surface level, but you look at the things they do, not just building, designing their own zip lines and constructing them. They've also developed proprietary patented braking and retrieval systems. They've created some manufacturing processes that are, again, they've patented. And they've also created software as well, specifically designed first internally, but then they're selling it to ziplining companies. So they're really one that, again, on the surface level, if you were just to look at them, you would think, oh, that's something that another provider did. And, they're one of those, anything qualifies companies. But when you really dig down to it, they're really very much qualified in all of the things they do. And we've been with them from pretty much the very beginning. So it's been very cool to watch them continue to grow and be able to claim the credits, which they then just pretty much reinvest right into their business to create all these new and different things. So it's been really cool, like I said, to watch them grow. And I think the research credit has been a big part of their success.
And that is a very unique situation, obviously. Probably something if you called and said, today a CPA called to have a zipline company, they qualify for the R&D credit, we'd probably laugh. That's why we need to have those conversations. But it is rewarding. You touched on something there, David, is that it is rewarding to see a company. I mean, we have one client that I've served since 2007. And I've worked with, and the controller is now the CFO. He's part owner of the company, and they're a food manufacturer, and they were in a region of the country that's not near Indianapolis. And how rewarding to see them continue to grow and grow and grow. And I can walk in the grocery store now and see their products plural, lining multiple shelves in Kroger grocery store chain here in Central Indiana.
Yeah.
It's very rewarding to be there to see, wow, and know that started at the R&D level. And to your point on the zipline company, to my point on this client, is that all started when they were a very much smaller shop, and they had the ingenuity and they took the risks, and for knowing that the R&D was there and our work helped fund some of that investment. So that's extremely rewarding.
Exactly. Yeah, very much so.
Well, David, thanks for joining us today. Thank you for all you do for our firm, and thank you for lending all of your expertise to today's episode. And audience, thank you for listening and watching. Catch us on YouTube at Let's Talk Tax Podcast or at McGuireSponsel.com for all show notes and follow up from each episode.